You are listening to Seniors Junction podcast. We're working to prevent seniors isolation, one conversation at a time. Your hosts today, Dr. Namrata Bagaria, myself, Dr. Paul Merkley. We're the co-founders of Seniors Junction, and our very special guest today is Dr. Deborah Morgan. She's a researcher at the Center for Innovative Aging. I should have said Innovative Aging, excuse me. The Center for Innovative Aging in Swansea. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you today.
Thank you. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I work, as you said, at the Centre for Innovative Aging, and my research focuses on aging in social isolation and loneliness in later life. But I've also got an interest in people who are aging with a disability who might experience loneliness across the life course.
Thanks. And before I turn it over to Namrata for questions, I'll just remind our viewers that when we say loneliness, we're talking about the quality of relationships and social connectedness or social isolation. We're referring to the number of connections. Thank you. Go ahead, Namrata.
So, Deb, I know you've worked extensively in this field, and could you educate us? What did you find about social isolation with seniors through your research?
So my work, I'm a mixed methods researcher, so I use both survey data and qualitative data. And the main study that we've worked on, I suppose most recently, around loneliness and social isolation, I looked at people's transition points into loneliness and how they coped with it on a day-to-day basis, and whether they transitioned out or whether they went on to a degenerative loneliness or isolation trajectory. And what we actually found was, as well as there being similarities and differences in the reasons that the risk factors that were predicting whether somebody became lonely or isolated, we actually broke it down into 4 categories of loneliness and isolation. So we had people who are not lonely and not isolated, those who are lonely but not isolated, those who were isolated and not lonely, and those who were both. So it's, just sort of clarify that. And what we actually found was, when we looked at our survey data, about 12% were lonely but not isolated. And then we had 11% were both. And about 18% were isolated, which we found was quite surprising. We expected more people to be probably lonely than isolated. So then we looked at the psychosocial risk factors then that were predicting inclusion in those different categories. And what we found was, in the category where they were isolated and not lonely, it was risk factors such as if they lived at a great distance from their family, so more than 50 miles, they were tended to be older if they were isolated, as in older age. They were also had, they were more likely to be childless, report being in very poor health or have a disability. And they also we found they had lower levels of interpersonal control, so the way they interacted with other people. And when we contrast that with loneliness, we found that those who reported being lonely but weren't isolated, they again had lived more than 50 miles from their family, but they were more likely to have low self-esteem than the low levels of interpersonal control. So there were differences. And I think that those differences are quite important when we're thinking of interventions for loneliness and isolation, because at the moment we don't really unpick it, do we? I think we think it's a one size fits all, but I think we need to now start to look at those nuances and how the different people's different trajectories influence and shape their loneliness experience. So alongside, as I said, the survey data, we also did I did some qualitative interviews with people who were also reported being either lonely or isolated. And we also found a number of people who were what I would term natural isolates. They were people who throughout their life course never really engaged with other people. They didn't seem to need a great number of people around. So for example, I had one older man who, when I asked him about his previous social interactions, said when he was in work, it was enough that his colleagues were around him day to day. He didn't need to see them outside of work. He didn't need friends outside of work. But it was only when his health deteriorated that he found himself plunged into loneliness as well as the isolation. And that's when it became problematic for him. So it's quite a complex picture, I think, of who becomes lonely and who becomes isolated and who becomes both.
Yes, very good. It's all fascinating. And I want to mention to our viewers that there's an excellent TED Talk by you that they could look up. Aside or in addition to what you've just said, do you have a vision for dealing with the problems of social isolation and loneliness?
Yeah, I think to date we've always focused on the individual, haven't we? And we see, there are interventions that people can go to because they've experienced loneliness and social isolation. And I think sometimes the interventions we suggest are more appropriate for social isolation than loneliness, because we assume that if we put other people, lonely or isolated people, or particularly lonely people, with other people, they're not going to be lonely anymore. But we know that's not the case. It's to do with the quality of their relationships. That might be more effective for social isolation. But I think there are other layers that we need to consider in terms of sort of societal responses to loneliness, the way we talk about loneliness and isolation, and even around the community that people live in that can influence and shape those social interactions. There was an interesting study done up in Scotland a few years ago, and they found that in neighbourhoods where there was a lot of deprivation, very high levels of deprivation, trust was with other people in the community was very low, and social isolation and loneliness was very high. So I think, at the moment, we're just trying to look at those individual factors, but we probably need to add in those additional layers and look at how policies around transport and planning, are there enough places in our local communities where people can bump into other people and start those interactions? And, we're all in our cars, aren't we? And we don't seem to meet people in the same way as we used to, sort of bumping into them in the supermarkets or, in banks, because, and particularly in the UK, a lot of the banks are shut in. So where do people go to meet other people? So I think, that's one of the areas I think we probably do need to look at in those different levels.
Yeah. And with
Two questions about intervention at the individual level. From things you said in your TED Talk. Our model places a lot of weight on purposeful activities undertaken with other people.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that. And the other thing I was interested in, you talked about the loss of confidence and the regaining of confidence.
Yeah, so many of the people. So I had participants who reported they were recovering from loneliness because they knew how to plug themselves back in, and their community responded in the way we all have expectations, don't we? If something happens or we're unwell, or we have expectations about who'll be there to support us, and sometimes those are not met either because our expectations are too high, or other people have things going on in their lives and they just don't have that capacity to be able to do what we expect them to do. So it was, we had people who knew, whose expectations were, they were managing their expectations, they knew how to plug themselves back in. But then we had a number of people who, one of the gentlemen I spoke to used to be a market trader. So he was very confident. He was used to talking to people he didn't know. But loneliness had eroded his confidence to such an extent, he felt he couldn't go back out into the social world on his own. He couldn't go into a bar because everybody was in groups and pairs, and it just made him feel really uncomfortable. So I think the loss of confidence is a big one, particularly if you've been lonely for a very long time and you get those repeated, or if you are isolated for a long time, you get those repeated hits. You might try and re-engage and get knocked back, or you might be hearing impaired and find that difficult going into a group setting to address your social isolation. And I've had participants who spoke about that, having difficulty with their hearing and not being able to manage that in a group situation. The loss of confidence is a big one. But you're right, you're so right about the meaningful activities. I think particularly, I remember doing a conference a few years ago, and we got a group of older people together with service providers and academics. And we wanted them all around the table sort of interacting, and we had presentations as you would, but we also had an older person who'd experienced loneliness and social isolation talking about their experience. And I had an academic, quite a senior academic, come up to me afterwards and said, I thought I knew what loneliness was until I heard this gentleman speak. And, it's that, that they were talking about, older people, they might just want to listen to Vera Lynn, but that might have been appropriate 30 years ago. But people who are older now, they're children of the swinging 60s, aren't they? They're going to want to listen to the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, and, they'll want other types of activities that reflect the generation that they grew up in. So I think it's making sure that those meaningful activities move with the times as well.
And as you've emphasized, activities that are undertaken with other people, not things one does alone. Yeah.
I remember one of the gentlemen I spoke to, he wanted to learn. He was very lonely, became lonely on the death of his mother. And he'd been her carer for many, many years. And he decided to get himself back out. He'd go and learn how to do spreadsheets as an adult education class. And he was the oldest person in the adult education class. But so he started that activity as a way of distracting himself from loneliness. But over time, he became vital to the group of younger people he was working with. They'd go to him for advice, and then they'd show him how to do the spreadsheets. So there was that reciprocal relationship going on, and it wasn't just them doing to him, they were doing with him. And eventually he started to transition out of loneliness, and the activity he was doing with them became more meaningful to him. So it started off as a distraction technique, but actually became a meaningful activity, and really helped him, support him, his transition out of loneliness and isolation, which was, amazing to see.
And somewhere in that process, a lot of confidence was gained.
Yeah, exactly. Because he felt he had a value. I think too often older people, if they've been isolated or lonely, they feel they don't have a value anymore to anyone. And actually, we all have a value. They've got a wealth of knowledge and experience that we can all benefit from. So I think, actually being able to drill down into that and show them that, they still have a value to the rest of us, I think is a lovely thing to see, and gives them the confidence and boosts their self-esteem as well, isn't it? To help them get back out there.
Thank you. Over to you, Namrata.
Sure. No, I think I just enjoyed listening to what you had to say. There's so many things I could interject, but without digressing too much, I would say with the work from home, school from home, the places where people met people are going away for many things. Your work was not just work, right? Many people found their partners at work. They found friends at work. And so, of course, I see a lot of challenges in the westernized countries where you live isolated anyways. And now this has added more isolation. And then topic on, finding purpose. We've seen some of our clients from they've transitioned really out of being introverted and shy to really being outspoken over a few months. So we've seen that in my own personal life. I have seen my own and somebody else I know, their journeys with this isolation, because I moved to a new country by myself. So of course you have different challenges. So I think what you speaks a lot. I think the only other point I would like to add, and maybe it's research, maybe it's not, but this is what I have started realizing. I think we all have unresolved childhood traumas, all of us. And also we have some coping techniques. And if we don't keep addressing those things, as we get those hits in life, it regresses. For example, somebody with childhood abandonment, unresolved, now gets widowed or widower, whatever that. So it's widowed. But and then suddenly that fear of abandonment is again activated because this person lost their parent in early childhood. or somebody who experiences loneliness and uses food as coping, and then you suddenly see eating disorder or obesity or whatever. Like so depending on what responses we have to our stressors, whether it's fight, flight, fawn, or freeze, we start seeing, I've seen young men drown themselves in work when they're lonely, because in that ways they don't feel lonely, and then there's burnout and loneliness together, and it's horrible. So
I often wonder about, you know, people who hoard, because sometimes when I've been talking to people who've experienced loneliness or isolation, there's a spatial element to it. They describe their personal space, their home, as being, one lady described it, she said there was a house, and she only lives in like a little cottage, but there was a house and she felt very small in the corner. So her solution to that was to get a cleaner to come in, because the cleaner would sing and fill the house with noise. I often wonder whether, and I've never done any research into it, but whether that's with sort of hoarding, whether that is people trying to fill the void with things.
I have seen similar, not with singing, but I know this person had 400 comic books, video games, and stuff in that house. So I thought I entered a nerd den, and I didn't know what that was. Like, I mean, the person is a brilliant researcher and a scientist, so that's a different thing. But and then you realize they had unresolved childhood traumas. And that's their way of feeling safe. You know, and some people. So for me, I mean, a lot of it is what you observe, and some of it we can do as researchers, because everything has to be, it's time consuming, protocol oriented, and it needs so much of expertise. But it's so multifaceted. But I think all chronic issues or chronic illnesses or chronic coping mechanisms that we have, I think it goes back to those unresolved childhood traumas and all these hits in life that come, whether it's loss of job or retirement, or a loss of hearing or loss of visual, because there's some sort of a loss that comes, and how are we dealing with those losses, and then what does that trigger in us?
I mean, you know, you hear, you know, people have spoken about being bullied when they were in school, and you know, and then they get negative comments, and like you said, that reinforces feeling that, you know, they're being rejected all over again, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of precursors to loneliness and isolation, not just the ones we think of in terms of, you know, area level deprivation and poverty, and whether you're born with a disability or not. There are other, like you say, other factors that play in that I don't think we've really investigated fully. They come out when you start to talk to people in interviews. You get these little snippets.
With pandemic, you will see that it's across the loneliness across age spectrum, like how you have nutrition across age spectrum. I would say that's where we are living at. Even in the womb, the mother of the prenatal, the mother is either isolated or lonely. For you're going in delivering babies by yourself because of the safety protocols. So you can imagine the amount of cortisol, stress hormones the mother is generating. We don't know the answers, but I'm assuming. So we have a definitely epigenetic shift that's happening with this topic that you work in, and we don't know for decades to come what's going to be the outcome of it.
I think that's a concern of mine, because we've been telling young children, you know, you're socialized, aren't you, at a very young age, and we're bringing up children at the moment because of the pandemic. Oh, don't go too close to that person because of COVID. And, you know, they're not necessarily mixing in schools like they would. And I do wonder what message that's embedding, whether in the future, you know, 50, 60 years down the road, whether we'll have a whole generation.
Like my cousin had a baby.
People.
He thinks this is normal clothing, right? So people who don't wear, because he was born in 2021, he's never seen people without masks except inside the house. So for me, those are the questions. But I think without going further digression, like coming back to the topic of the vision, which you said, one thing which you mentioned in your TED talk, I think, which was interesting, was also stigma, right? So I would start with that and say that given you have this vision, that it's an individualized approach, it's not just one size fits all, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges in solving isolation?
I think with the stigma, I mean, it, you know, just because you're lonely doesn't mean that you don't have, and I say this in my TED talk, that it doesn't mean nobody cares for you. It's a set of circumstances. But I think sometimes when we hear about policymakers and the media talking about loneliness, they talk about an epidemic and neglected older people, and it's a tragedy. And I think these words just reinforce that stigma. And I think we need to talk about loneliness in a more, in a broader way, I suppose. It is devastating if you've got chronic loneliness, but not everyone's chronically lonely. Some people find their own ways out of it. But if we just say, they're almost giving the impression that once you're lonely, that's it. That's the way you're going to stay. But actually, we need to talk more about our experiences of loneliness and how we've coped with it and how we've managed it. And that was one of the things in the study I'd done, that I asked people who'd recovered from loneliness what they would tell a friend who was lonely. And they came up with a list of sort of solutions. And then they're nothing, they talk about telling somebody, talking about it to somebody that you trust, try and reconnect yourself. It's nothing groundbreaking, but we actually made it into a little booklet. And that booklet, back in 2019, we handed out something like 20,000 hard copies of that booklet. It's got a list of resources in there so people know where to go for help. But it's starting those conversations, isn't it? Loneliness is something, if we think it's just me, people are going to interpret it as we have no friends, or that there's something wrong with us. And the media are reinforcing that with this narrative about being an epidemic and neglected older people. You're not going to come out and talk about it, are you? Because you're going to feel shame.
Exactly. I was going to say that there's a lot of shame.
There's a lot of shame, and you're just exacerbating the problem. So I think we need to talk about it in a different way. And I think I do irritate people sometimes in meetings when they start talking about it. And I'm like, can we change the way we're talking about this? And you can't put a positive spin on it, but take away some of that negativity, because what we're doing is reinforcing it.
And I also think there's a cultural connotation. For example, grief, loneliness. Some cultures you can talk about it. Some cultures, let's say I come from South Asian culture, it's really, you don't talk about it. And I like to talk about it because, I work in this field. I try to be sensitive and talk about it. And then you hear things like, I will do everything but not take therapy or not do group talking. That's for the weak. I'm not weak.
Yeah.
They will do all kinds of projects, they'll do all activities, but they will not talk about it. And that's another kind of weird, which we found out, like with the 4 quadrants, which you were talking.
Yeah.
We found some people, they're super in doing activities or camouflage, very social, but inside they are lonely, and they're making it worse for themselves because they're lying to themselves.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I go anywhere, if I get, if you jump in a taxi or something and they ask what you're doing and you say you study loneliness, you start to get the stories of people, lonely taxi drivers or taxi drivers who know somebody they pick up every week and take them to the shops, and it might be expensive for them, but they're lonely. That's the only person they talk to, so you start to get these stories, and it's fascinating. When I did the TED talk, and you'll know because you've heard it, I talk about the gentleman with the boxes and all these open boxes. And at the end of the TED talk, I had a woman came up to me, a younger woman, and she asked if she could come and visit me down at the university. So she came a few days later and she said, "You've just described me. I've got Christmas presents in the house." So this was in the summer. I've got Christmas presents in the house for the children of friends who still haven't been to see me. And she was lonely and her mother was lonely since the death of her dad. And neither of them had ever spoken about it because they both felt the shame and the stigma of it. But after being at the TED talk, she went and said to her mum, "Are you ordering stuff online because you want the postman to come?" And she was like, "Yes, actually, I feel really lonely." And they'd had that conversation. And it was the first time, the day she came to see me, was the first time her mum had been out with her friends in 4 years. So it's just about starting that conversation, isn't it, with people?
Yeah. I think we've also noticed now that people ask us, what do you do? we know everybody's personal life, like every person, like suddenly, if we are in a board meeting, whether we are in a business meeting, we are on the street, where we are in the grocery shop, no matter where, we get stories on a daily basis. So like you said, right, it suddenly makes you realize your research and your startup is so small compared to what's out there.
Yeah.
And it's just you're just a conversation opener in some ways, you know. And
Yeah.
that's why the tagline of our podcast is preventing isolation one conversation at a time, because sometimes we don't know which podcast does what for whom. We don't know who's listening. We can't track people, thankfully, privacy. But but you're right, Paul, you were saying something.
No, I was just, when you finish, I'll just ask about what advice she has for us.
Okay. No, I'm just like saying that hasn't our life changed so much? It's transformed.
Oh yes, I almost said bridge club too. You know, I hear stories, incredible stories from people.
Yeah.
Incredible stories.
I mean, it's a very privileged position to be in, isn't it? That you're trusted enough because of the work that you do, that people tell you something that makes them extremely vulnerable. And I see that as being in a very privileged position, that they feel they can open up and talk about that, you know, about being lonely or being isolated. You know, I think it's, you know, I think it's a great thing, because at least if they've spoken to me, then they might start speaking to other people about it.
That might be the starting point.
Exactly. So, and I think that's why we all need to talk about our own experiences of loneliness to start that conversation.
Our own vulnerability. And that's why Paul wrote a book on it. It's called Retired, Widowed, Purposeless, Full. So he explained his story, and from then suddenly it's different for us. Like life is not the same it used to be. You know, the pandemic, it brings in its own kind of loneliness. Like for example, we have new restrictions where we are living. So in the beginning of this week, I was a little jittery. I'm like, oh my God, we're like again inside and you can't meet people. And although I work in this and I have my own, so all I did like the whole weekend was make a list of theaters to watch and Broadways to see or whatever, and research to do. But it takes that extra half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours of planning, and then calling a friend and telling, like my first call was to Paul, like, Paul, I feel lonely. He's like, okay. And I talk to hundreds of people in the week, not just like 10, 20, like because of my work. But what I'm trying to tell everyone who's listening is admit it to yourself. You can lie to the whole world, whichever you want to pretend. Like I work in this business and I'm more aware of when I feel it. Today, I'm not. And it's not like a permanent thing. Sometimes it's just some of the days, the sunlight, the winters in Canada are challenging. And it's a cyclical, loneliness is a cyclical process. It's never completely in, it's never completely out, you know.
I mean, it is a natural human emotion, isn't it? And we forget that. We'll talk about happiness and we'll talk about, you know, joy and sadness, but we don't want to talk about loneliness because it's got those connotations. I mean, I get asked to do a lot of talks, and I've now been labelled as lonely woman. And when I've done some stuff, people go, are you the lonely woman? Well, yeah.
I saw your Twitter handle.
Yeah, so I've just had a journalist interview me, and she said, you're in my phone as Lonely Deborah. So I thought, well, I may as well just embrace it. It does what it says on the tin.
CIA, Lonely Deborah.
Lonely Deborah.
Paul?
Well, what advice would you have for our company and our projects?
I think what you're doing is start with the older people themselves, isn't it? And ask them what they want, because too often, as I said, I think we do too. Older people are not with them. And, you know, they're a very diverse cohort, aren't they? They're not all the same. They've all got different experiences, different backgrounds. And I think we need to start with them, because the trajectories into loneliness are very individual and personalised. And I think we need to do any interventions need to be the same. They need to be personalised to the individual and sort of map onto their loneliness or isolation trajectory. So I think we need to start with the older people themselves and see what they want what sort of support they want, if they want any. They might actually just want to go out and help somebody else. You know, I mean, I know in the UK sometimes we get difficulties with volunteering because older people don't, a lot of older people do volunteer, but then some don't want to because they think it's a bit do-gooderish, but they'll help other people, but they don't want it labelled as volunteering. So I think you have to start with the older people themselves and different groups of older people to see what it is exactly that they need.
I agree with that, and that's where I'm trying to understand through my research if I can find this exact equation. Who needs what, and can we sort of classify it, have an offline classifier, and then maybe machine learning make it more dynamic and interactive. But I hope I find some stuff. Let's see. I'll let you know in a year's time what I find.
Great stuff.
So my last question to you is, if people want to find you, what's the best way to find you?
So I'm on Twitter as @LonelyDeborah. Or I can be contacted on email, and my email is d.j.morgan@swansea.ac.uk.
So Deb, thank you so much for this conversation. It
No
was
problem
really
at all.
delightful.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.